Dawn broke cold and brittle over Winnipeg on February 19th, 1942. Snow clung to the edges of rooftops. The river lay frozen in a sheet of pale blue, and the city stirred with the ordinary rhythm of a winter morning. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Posters had gone up across Manitoba in the days prior, warning residents that a massive civil defense drill was coming, part of the Victory Loan campaign designed to boost wartime fundraising. Many people expected sirens and blackout tests. Few imagined that before the day was over, the streets would be filled with German uniforms, barricades, and staged arrests that felt uncomfortably real. The plan had been drawn up quietly by provincial officials, military leaders, and organizers of the loan drive. They called it Operation Lemon, though most would come to know it as If Day. The idea was simple in theory and bold in execution. If Manitoba failed to support the war effort, what would happen if the Nazis crossed the Atlantic and took Canada by force? To show the public what that nightmare might look like, Winnipeg would become a stage. Soldiers from local regiments would don replica Wehrmacht and SS uniforms. Mock bombing runs and simulated firefights would erupt in parks and intersections. Government buildings would be seized. The mayor would be taken prisoner. Newspapers had hinted at something unprecedented, but even they did not reveal the scale of the performance. As the sun rose higher, people began gathering along the main streets. Children pressed their faces to cold windows, watching columns of Canadian troops prepare for the spectacle. The idea that their own soldiers would soon become the enemy felt strange, almost too daring. In the early hours, a bitter wind swept along Portage Avenue as the first sirens wailed. The drill had begun. A deep rumble rolled through the air as mock explosions sounded at the city's outskirts. Winnipeg residents turned their heads toward the noise, and for a fleeting moment, the war raging across the ocean felt frighteningly close. At 7 a.m., radio announcements declared that enemy forces were approaching the city. Listeners heard urgent voices describing imaginary battles to the north and east. And the tone was so serious that some households wondered whether this was still theater. The sound of boots striking pavement soon followed. Down Portage Avenue marched a formation of soldiers in German uniforms. Their helmets painted the dull gray of the Wehrmacht, their armbands emblazoned with black symbols. People whispered nervously as the troops advanced. Many had read daily reports of Nazi occupations throughout Europe. Seeing those uniforms on Canadian soil stirred emotions that were real, not rehearsed. Canadian troops playing the defenders staged a retreat and made their stand near the intersection. Blank rounds cracked through the air, echoing off brick storefronts. Smoke canisters filled the street with chalky clouds. The clatter of makeshift machine gun nests and the shouts of officers tightened the illusion. A woman clutching her shopping basket gasped as soldiers rushed by her, one of them telling her to take shelter behind a stone wall. Even though everyone knew this was a simulation, the cold and rising tension made it feel far too authentic. Moments later, the German forces pushed forward. They overwhelmed the defenders, planted large black flags bearing iron crosses at strategic points, and declared the city captured. The transformation happened with startling efficiency. A group of uniformed soldiers strode into City Hall and confronted Mayor John Queen, informing him that Winnipeg was now under enemy control. When they arrested him and escorted him outside, crowds gathered to watch with wide eyes. The mayor played his role with gravity, understanding that this day was meant to shock people into recognizing the stakes of the global conflict. Across the city, Soldiers detained prominent officials and civic leaders. Police officers were disarmed and marched away. Streets were blocked with wooden barricades. Signs bearing German translations were nailed over familiar street names. Portage Avenue became Adolf Hitler Strasse. The Hudson's Bay Company store, a massive symbol of Canadian commerce, received a notice declaring it under the authority of the occupying power. The sense of unreality deepened as people stared at these signs, wondering how surreal it must have felt for civilians in occupied France or the Netherlands to wake up one morning and find their cities renamed. Radio Winnipeg shifted to a simulated occupation broadcast. A stern announcer declared that all citizens must comply with regulations issued by the new regime. People were instructed to report for identification papers and curfews. Flyers were handed out warning of harsh punishment for sabotage or disobedience. The scriptwriters behind Operation Lemon intended these details to be unsettling, and they succeeded. Even play-acting tyranny carried a heavy psychological weight. At a school near the center of the city, children sat at their desks while a teacher explained that everything happening outside was part of an exercise. Yet the muffled sounds of mock gun battles made them fidget nervously. When a squad of soldiers in gray uniforms entered the building to announce new rules, a few students instinctively shrank back. One of the soldiers later admitted that he felt a chill performing the scene because he had read accounts of real Nazi takeovers. The reenactment gave him a new appreciation for what civilians overseas endured daily. Throughout the morning, military vehicles roared across downtown. Some carried loudspeakers blaring occupation orders. Others hauled prisoners taken during the staged roundups. At the Legislative Building, soldiers unfurled a large Nazi banner to replace the Canadian flag. The image was striking and deeply unsettling. This was the heart of Manitoban democracy, now draped in the symbol of oppression. Spectators stood silent as the cold wind tugged at the edges of the flag, making it snap sharply against the stone columns. Winnipeg newspapers prepared special editions for the day, printed to mimic the kind of propaganda that might circulate under real occupation. Headlines proclaimed the triumphant arrival of German forces and the downfall of democratic rule in Manitoba. Articles warned citizens to obey their new masters. For many residents, reading those words in familiar paper was one of the most jarring moments of IF Day. It illuminated how swiftly information could be manipulated and how powerless a population might feel when their freedoms vanished overnight. Despite the seriousness of the message, the mood among the participants was one of focused commitment. Thousands of volunteers had prepared for weeks. Soldiers practiced their roles with discipline, even while knowing this was all for a war loan drive. Civic leaders cooperated fully because they understood that the fight against fascism required public support and financial resources. Every explosion, every arrest, and every stern announcement carried a purpose. They wanted citizens to grasp that the war was not a distant story from Europe, but a threat that demanded real sacrifice. By late morning, much of Winnipeg looked convincingly occupied. Black flags marked intersections, patrols roamed the districts. People spoke in hushed tones as they went about their errands, glancing over their shoulders at soldiers who marched with rigid precision. Some laughed nervously, trying to remind themselves that it was only a drill. Others felt a knot of fear under their winter coats as they imagined the real thing. The spectacle was working. Donations to the Victory Loan campaign would soar in the coming days. As noon approached, the staged occupation settled into an eerie quiet. Smoke cleared from earlier mock battles. The wind carried faint sounds of marching boots down the long avenues of the city. Winnipeg had become a living theater of war, a chilling demonstration of what failure abroad could mean at home. The officials who planned IF Day watched from observation posts, taking notes and gauging public reaction. They wanted to know whether the message had landed. That day, the question hung silently over every snow-covered street. If this were real, what would happen next? By early afternoon on February 19th, 1942, Winnipeg no longer felt like the calm prairie city it had been at sunrise. Under a sky the color of cold steel, the simulated invading forces tightened their grip on every corner of the city. The black flags hung heavily over intersections, stark symbols of a power that Canadians had read about only in foreign news dispatches. Now, those symbols dominated their own streets. And even though the occupation was staged, the effect was that of a waking nightmare. Winnipeg had become a living illustration of what tyranny might look like if the war were lost. The occupying soldiers moved with a disciplined rhythm. They were Canadian troops wearing replica Nazi uniforms. But from a distance, the illusion was convincing. On Main Street, they checked papers, questioned passers-by, and issued strict orders about movement through the city center. Children watched them from behind store windows, their faces pressed against the glass. A few adults walked by with uneasy smiles, pushing themselves to treat this as a drill. But their steps were quick, their breaths sharp in the cold air. The presence of armed soldiers speaking commands in clipped, German-accented English made the occupation feel uncomfortably authentic. One of the earliest acts of authority came at the Winnipeg Tribune. Soldiers marched into the newsroom and declared it seized. Editors and reporters were herded into a corner and told their work was now restricted. To emphasize the point, the soldiers issued a mock proclamation stating that all newspapers must support the new regime. The Tribune printed a special edition under occupation, filled with fabricated announcements, aggressive warnings, and reminders of the population's supposed duty to obey. When that paper hit the street, residents paused in their tracks as they scanned the headlines. Many later recalled that reading a Canadian newspaper filled with enemy propaganda was one of the most disturbing moments of IF Day. Around the corner, members of the simulated Gestapo set up a headquarters in the Royal Alexandra Hotel. They posted a long list of new regulations on the walls outside. Curfews were established. Public gatherings were forbidden. Businesses would operate only under strict supervision. Citizens were ordered to surrender radios and weapons. Every rule carried the threat of severe punishment. People stopped to read the notices, imagining how terrifying such commands must have been under actual occupation in Europe. The realization that millions of civilians lived under such restrictions every day settled uneasily in the minds of Winnipeggers. As the operation continued, the staged arrests grew more dramatic. In front of the legislative building, soldiers seized provincial cabinet ministers and marched them down the steps in full view of the public. The men were placed in trucks and driven to makeshift detention centers. Civilians lining the sidewalks fell silent as the vehicles passed. Even though everyone understood the performance, the sight of elected leaders being taken away stirred something deeper. A cold understanding of how quickly democratic institutions could crumble if overpowered by a dictatorship. At schools across the city, the occupation unfolded in quieter, but no less unsettling ways. In one classroom, children were told to rise as uniformed soldiers entered and announced that new rules were in effect. The teacher stood stiffly at her desk, participating in the drill, yet unable to fully hide her discomfort. The soldiers explained that certain subjects were prohibited and that any student suspected of disloyalty would be reported. The children listened in wide-eyed silence. Later interviews with those who had been students that day revealed that some carried the memory for the rest of their lives. They had seen history lessons about European occupation come alive in their own classrooms, and the fear it sparked was real. Elsewhere, mock concentration camps were briefly demonstrated. Although no attempt was made to replicate their horrific conditions, the symbolism alone was enough to make spectators uncomfortable. Soldiers erected barbed wire enclosures and marched detainees inside as part of the scenario. The message was clear. If Winnipeg ever fell to fascism, no one would be spared the consequences. The organizers intended this demonstration to encourage stronger support for the victory loan, and the anxiety it provoked drove the point home. Throughout the city, German renamed signs remained fixed over familiar landmarks. The Fort Garry Hotel became the Soldatenheim. The intersections along Portage Avenue bore labels that turned everyday geography into enemy territory. Residents walked past these signs reluctantly, as though each one carried the weight of a warning. When asked later, many people explained that it was not the uniforms or the mock gunfire that unsettled them most, but the altered names on their own streets. Something as simple as rewriting a city's map revealed how swiftly identity could be erased under occupation. Winnipeg's police force also became part of the staged oppression. Officers were disarmed, their stations overtaken, and their duties reassigned. Some officers were marched away by the invading soldiers to simulate imprisonment. Others were told to assist the occupiers in enforcing the new rules. Seeing local police suddenly stripped of authority left a lasting impression on spectators. It underscored how occupation dismantles familiar systems and replaces them with rule by force. The radio continued broadcasting updates as the afternoon progressed. Listeners tuned in to hear stern announcements in heavily accented English, warning citizens of curfew hours and describing imaginary battles taking place outside the city. Mothers paused while preparing supper, hearing those broadcasts echo through their kitchens, and wondered what families in France, Norway, or Belgium must have felt when their radios carried similar messages for real. The aim of Operation Lemon was to shrink the emotional distance between Canadians and the war overseas, and the radio proved one of the most effective tools for doing so. Not all reactions were solemn. Some residents treated the day as spectacle, gathering in crowds to watch mock firefights or photograph soldiers posing stiffly in their German uniforms. A few young boys ran after military trucks, laughing as they pretended to be part of the resistance. Yet even these moments carried an undertone of seriousness. Behind the excitement was an acknowledgement that they were play acting in a scenario others were living painfully and unwillingly under foreign occupation. As the staged oppression deepened, the financial goal of the day began to reveal itself more clearly. Victory loan booths set up across Winnipeg reported surging donations. One volunteer later remarked that people approached with a determination in their eyes, handing over contributions as though they had personally witnessed the dangers of defeat. In truth, they had. The mock tyranny unfolding around them was fiction. But the potential consequences were not. Those who had been skeptical of fundraising efforts now felt compelled to contribute. Meanwhile, the occupation forces extended their scenarios beyond the city center. Rural towns surrounding Winnipeg participated in their own scaled-down exercises. German signs appeared in small villages. Mock battles were staged along highways. The participation of these smaller communities reinforced the idea that no part of Manitoba would be safe under enemy control. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in Canada, involving thousands of volunteers, hundreds of soldiers, and coordination across multiple municipalities. As the afternoon wore on, the icy wind sharpened, blowing snow across the dark flags and helmeted troops. Winnipeg moved through the hours in a strange state of half reality, half performance. A sense of anticipation grew. People knew that at some point the occupation would end and the city would be liberated by friendly forces. Yet they also sensed that the story of If Day was building toward a moment designed to strike with the same force as the morning sirens. The occupying soldiers maintained their stronghold, patrolling intersections and guarding buildings as though reinforcement fleets waited on the horizon. The city, bound by curfew, propaganda, and staged oppression, felt the full weight of what a Nazi victory might have meant for Canadians. And though every uniform, every command, and every flag belonged to a simulation, the fear and tension in the air belonged entirely to the people who breathed it. As the shadows of late afternoon stretched across the frozen streets, Winnipeg waited for what would come next, suspended in its unsettling role as a conquered city. The liberation had not yet begun, and the lesson of If Day had only grown sharper with each passing hour. As the pale winter sun dipped behind the rooftops of Winnipeg on February 19, 1942, the city reached the most suspenseful moment of its grand, unsettling spectacle. For hours, residents had lived under the simulated occupation. Black flags had snapped sharply in the wind. Curfew notices and false decrees had spread across neighborhoods. Soldiers in German uniforms had marched through the streets with the cold precision of an invading army. Even though everyone knew the occupation was temporary, a quiet anxiety had settled across the city like the frost forming on window panes. But now came the scene everyone was waiting for. If Day was about to move from oppression to liberation. Shortly before evening, word spread that Canadian forces were mounting a counterattack. It began with the distant crack of blank rounds as friendly troops staged engagements outside the city center. Crowds gathered near safer areas to watch, their breath rising in clouds as they strained to see through the drifting snow. Defenders moved methodically, clearing intersections and pushing back the troops playing the role of invaders. The sound of explosions rolled across downtown as smoke drifted between buildings, transforming familiar landmarks into backdrops of imagined conflict. For a moment, citizens caught a glimpse of the kind of resistance that European cities had mounted in real life. Even in simulation, the energy felt intense. As the Canadian troops advanced, the occupying soldiers retreated toward set positions. This part of the drill had been carefully choreographed so the city could witness its liberation in dramatic fashion. On the steps of the legislative building, a crowd formed to watch the climactic moment. The enormous Nazi flag that had hung there since morning fluttered heavily in the wind. When the defenders finally pushed through the last lines of resistance and reclaimed the grounds, the sight of that flag being lowered drew cheers that echoed through the wide courtyard. It was lifted down by soldiers with a kind of ceremonial urgency, then quickly replaced by the red and white flag of Canada. The contrast was striking. One symbol had represented fear and oppression, the other unity and hope. Inside City Hall, a similar scene unfolded. The mayor and other officials who had been arrested earlier in the day were symbolically released and escorted back into the building. Crowds applauded as Mayor John Queen resumed his place before the public, raising his hand to address them. His voice carried across the cold air as he reminded citizens that this entire production had been created for a purpose that extended far beyond dramatic effect. If Day, he said, was a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. He urged Winnipeggers to continue supporting the Victory Loan campaign so that Canada would never face such tyranny for real. Following the staged liberation, the city began to shed the visual markers of the occupation. Soldiers climbed ladders to remove German street signs and replace them with the familiar English ones. Black flags were taken down from government buildings. Barricades were dismantled. Shops reopened their doors. The transformation back to normalcy happened swiftly, and residents watched with relief as the symbols of one of the darkest ideologies in history disappeared from their streets. Yet for many, the memory of seeing them there in the first place lingered uncomfortably. As the evening continued, families gathered at dinner tables to talk about what they had witnessed. Parents described the scenes to younger children, too afraid to venture outside. Teachers reflected on the emotional reactions they had seen in their classrooms. Workers compared stories about the tension that had rippled through offices and shops during the staged arrests and proclamations. Radio commentators, now freed from occupation scripts, spoke with renewed vigor about the stakes of the global conflict. They reminded listeners that real families across Europe did not have the luxury of seeing their occupiers climb into trucks and leave at the end of the day. For them, liberation was not a performance, but a distant hope. Over the next 24 hours, newspapers across Manitoba and Canada described "If Day" with astonishment. The Winnipeg Tribune and Free Press printed photographs of soldiers dragging away officials, German flags hanging from buildings, and crowds watching the liberation scenes. Editorials praised the operation's effectiveness in reminding Canadians that the war demanded sacrifices not just from soldiers overseas, but from citizens at home. The scale of the exercise was unprecedented in North America. Roughly 3,000 soldiers and civilians had participated directly, with tens of thousands more watching in person. The impact was immediate. Victory Loan contributions surged dramatically, surpassing fundraising goals and proving that the shock of the simulation had achieved its intended effect. In Ottawa, federal officials took notice. Reports reached political leaders describing the powerful reaction in Winnipeg and the way If Day had reinvigorated public engagement with the war effort. Commentators across the country debated the ethics and creativity of staging such an intense event. But most agreed that Operation Lemon had been one of the most memorable propaganda efforts of the Canadian home front. The United States press even covered the event, noting that few cities had gone to such lengths to bring war's dangers into public view. Winnipeg had transformed itself into a case study of how imagination, fear, and patriotism could merge in a single day of performance. For many who participated, the emotional effect remained long after the uniforms were returned and the smoke cleared. Soldiers who had worn German replicas commented that the experience unsettled them. Some said the looks they received from civilians reminded them of the real suffering inflicted by the regime, whose uniforms they had briefly adopted. Teachers recalled the silence in classrooms when troops had entered pretending to deliver new rules. Shopkeepers spoke of moments when they forgot, briefly, that everything happening outside was staged. The simulation had blurred the line between theater and reality, enough to plant a lasting memory in the minds of thousands. Years later, historians would note that If Day provided Canadians with a rare opportunity to confront the possibility that their own freedoms were not guaranteed. While Canada was geographically distant from the European theater, the idea that the war could reach their doorstep was not impossible in 1942. German U-boats had already prowled the Atlantic coast, sinking ships near Newfoundland. Japanese submarines had attacked targets along the Pacific shoreline. The war was global, unpredictable, and relentless. If day served to remind people that isolation was no shield. Vigilance and unity were essential. As night settled fully over Winnipeg, the city exhaled. The occupiers were gone. Storefronts glowed with warm light again. Children walked home with their parents, no longer glancing nervously at intersections. Yet the lesson of the day remained visible in the expressions of those who stepped into the crisp air. They understood more clearly now why sacrifices were needed, why bonds and rations mattered, and why their letters of support to soldiers overseas carried such weight. They had lived, even briefly, in a version of Winnipeg that could have existed if the war had turned against the Allies. Over the following weeks, local radio hosts invited residents to share their experiences. Many described feelings they had not expected. Some admitted that they had laughed at first, thinking the drill would be little more than entertainment. But as soon as the German signs appeared and the soldiers began rounding up officials, the mood changed. Others said they had been deeply moved by the liberation scene when the Canadian flag rose again over the legislative building. One woman commented that she never looked at the flag the same way afterward. It had become more than a symbol. It represented the fragile, precious nature of freedom. If Day eventually became part of Canada's wartime legacy, a strange and bold reminder of how imagination could be used to strengthen national resolve. It stood as proof that even at great distance from the front lines, citizens could feel the emotional weight of the conflict. Through fear, shock, and relief, Winnipeg had helped people understand what was at stake. And as the city returned fully to normal life, the memory of that single winter day lingered. It had been a performance, yet the emotions it stirred were genuine. Winnipeg had briefly stepped into the darkest shadows of the war so that its people could better appreciate the light of liberation.